Fragile X syndrome. In 1943, James Purdon Martin and Julia Bell found a family in which 11 males had cognitive impairment and suggested that it could be genetic and sex-linked. In 1969, Herbert Lubbs discovered the Fragile X gene and noticed that in people with mental retardation it looked different, which I'll explain soon. This gene, called the Fragile X mental retardation gene, was first sequenced by researchers in 1991. DNA is essentially a sequence of 4 different nucleotides represented by letters A, T, C, and G. Fragile X syndrome falls under the family of trinucleotide repeat disorders, which are disorders caused by an abnormal number of repeats in a certain section of 3 nucleotides. In Fragile X, a set of CGG in the genetic code repeats more than it should. 5 to 44 repeats is the normal amount. 200 plus repeats is a full mutation, and some people have 45 to 200 repeats, which is called a premutation, not a full mutation, but it could still lead to some symptoms or related disorders. If there are over 200 repeats, DNA methylation occurs in the cytosine. This affects the promoter of the gene, and the gene is essentially turned off. At the site of the mutation, chromatin will become condensed from the methyl groups and look more fragile, hence this gene codes for Fragile X mental retardation protein. When turned off, protein is not made, which leads to symptoms. In those with a premutation, FMR1 actually overproduces mRNA, which is the genetic blueprint for FMRP. This leads to some related disorders, which I'll talk about later. Fragile X is one of the most common inherited causes of intellectual disability. 1 in every 3,600 males and 1 in every 4,000 to 6,000 females worldwide have the mutation. Anytime I mention proportionally higher rates or different phenotypes, remember that this is due to the fact that men only have one X chromosome and therefore no second chromosome to mask the effects of the defective gene. Fragile X syndrome displays mosaicism, which makes it neither a dominant or recessive gene. 1 in every 259 women are carriers. They have a 30 to 40% chance of giving birth to a male child with the disease and a 15 to 20% chance of having a female child with the disease. Note that men who are Fragile X carriers will pass the altered gene to all of their daughters, but none of their sons. Daughters of carrier men are expected to be intellectually normal, but are at risk of having children affected with Fragile X syndrome. Symptoms. Females almost always have less noticeable symptoms due to the skewed X chromosome activation that I previously noted. Symptoms do vary in severity from person to person due to factors like sex and number of repeats in the gene. No symptoms are fatal. People with Fragile X can usually live a long and healthy life if no related disorders arise. Physical symptoms include distinct facial features such as large ears, long and narrow faces, and high-arched palates, flat feet, hyperflexible joints, and in boys, enlarged but functional sex organs. Mental symptoms include early developmental delays, learning disabilities, which are less likely in girls, autistic-like behaviors like poor eye contact, hand biting, hand flapping, and hypersensitivity. Social and behavior problems. In boys, this is usually trouble paying attention, acting and speaking without thinking, hyperactivity, and in girls, it is usually extreme shyness. Criteria for diagnosis is a full mutation consisting of more than 200 CGG repeats in the FMR1 gene, plus hypermethylation. Diagnosis used to be done through karyotype, which is just the visual appearance of the X chromosome under a microscope, noting whether a fragile site could be seen. Now it is done through counting the number of repeats on the gene or quantifying the mRNA and FMRP protein to better understand full and premutation patients. This could be done either through a polymerase chain reaction or a southern blot. Prenatal testing is also available through amniocentesis, which is the sample of amniotic fluid, or chorionic villus sampling, which is sampling from the placenta. The average diagnosis age is around 35 to 37 months in boys and around 41.6 months in girls. This is usually when parents notice developmental delays and unusual facial features. Fragile X syndrome has no cure, so treatment is directed at symptoms. Mental symptoms can be managed through therapy or medications such as SSRIs. Most children will also require an individual learning plan for school. And physical symptoms themselves are not harmful, but usually patients have related diseases that should be treated by a specialist. This brings me to the final point, which is diseases related to Fragile X syndrome. First is autism. There's a strong genetic component to autism, and the leading genetic cause is Fragile X syndrome. About 1/3 of people with Fragile X have enough of these characteristics to meet the criteria to be diagnosed with autism. It is important to note that autism is a spectrum, and also symptoms may present slightly differently in people with Fragile X related autism than autism on its own. Another related mental disorder is hyperactivity disorders like ADHD. Related physical disorders include seizures, which affect 10 to 20% with Fragile X, ear infections, eye problems like strabismus, farsightedness, astigmatism, heart problems like a mitral valve prolapse, and this is seen in about half of all adults with Fragile X, aortic enlargement and high blood pressure, and finally scoliosis. Then there are disorders that arise in people with pre-mutations of Fragile X syndrome. First is Fragile X associated primary ovarian insufficiency, which affects approximately 20 to 25% of women with a pre-mutation. Symptoms include infertility, decreased ovarian function, early menopause, and irregular or absent cycles. Next is Fragile X associated tremor slash ataxia syndrome. It was discovered in and is much more common in males, but it is also possible in females. It is adult onset, usually in people 50 plus years. The major diagnostic symptoms are an intention tremor, which occurs when the hand is being used for something, gait ataxias, which are balance problems like falling, needing help on stairs, trouble stepping on enough curbs, a wide gait, which is the manner of walking, and FXTAS inclusions within brain cells. Other symptoms include Parkinson's, memory problems, executive functioning problems, neuropathy or numbness and tingling of the extremities, mood instability, cognitive decline, and autonomic functioning problems such as impotence or loss of bladder or bowel functions.